Professor, thank you so much for joining me in this interview. I'm really honored to be here with you today. I'm sure you are really busy, and I'm really appreciated to joining me. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. It's an exciting thing to be able to connect with universities around the world.
Thank you so much. Professor, in this interview, we'll discuss topic related to Kant and religion. But firstly, I would like to start from early stage in your life, your personal journey toward academic and intellectual study. How did you start? Did you start reading about philosophy in childhood, or it's beginning in older age? And please tell us about the impact of childhood on your professional future. Thank you.
Sure. I grew up in a suburb of Toronto in Canada, and I'd say probably around the age of 10 or so, I started to develop an interest in physics. So I was reading sort of works that were written for the lay audience, the sort of things like Isaac Asimov books on quantum mechanics and so on around that age. And so basically from around the age of 10 until give or take around the age of 18, I was focused on physics. That's what I wanted to move into. And then I happened to pick up a book, I don't remember the reason why, on existentialism around the age of 18. Found it very, very interesting. And excuse me, then started university, not really having a clear sense of where I wanted to go, but I decided that I gained an interest in the nature of consciousness and the nature of experience. And so rather than looking at physics, I started to become more interested in how it is that we even come to experience the world and frame scientific concepts and so on. So that moved me from physics to an array of other issues, philosophical, psychological, and so on. And then as an undergraduate, I did my undergraduate at York University in Toronto. I actually lived right near their campus growing up. And I took 2 different philosophy courses in my first year and found them very compelling. And so I decided to become a philosophy major. And while I was an undergraduate, my interest was forming around the philosophy of religion. So by the time I was graduating, that's what I wanted to work on. And I had a number of professors who had completed a interdisciplinary master's degree in philosophy and religion at Yale. So they encouraged me to go to that same program, which I did. And while I was there, I happened to be at Yale at a time where their philosophy department was not doing well. Lots of senior faculty had just left, and it was really not a strong department, unfortunately. So I decided to look elsewhere, and I wanted to stay in New England. And so with my interest in philosophy of religion kind of moving more towards German philosophy at that time, I decided to go to Boston University, that was very strong in German philosophy and was sort of in the market to hire a senior Kantian and was recruiting Henry Allison. So I decided to go to Boston University and completed my dissertation there with Henry Allison on the committee. And the dissertation that I wrote was focused on sort of the core question of, does Kant ever provide an adequate argument to justify that we should regard ourselves as beings who have free will and whose wills are determined or governed by pure practical reason? So it basically went through the argument in the 3rd chapter of the groundwork and the argument in the 2nd critique and other issues related to the nature of opinion, knowledge, and belief, and so forth. And sort of got to the point at the end of the dissertation where I never found that Kant's arguments were satisfactory. So while on the one hand, I was sympathetic with the idea that we have free will and that our wills are determined by reason, I was sympathetic with the picture of agency that Kant had. I never was convinced that he had an ideal argument. The job market being what it is, I had sort of the good fortune of quickly moving right into a tenure track job. And, many people could spend 10 years on the market before finding a tenure track job. But what my disposition was, I had a few other options. I did not want to spend 3 years at one school, 3 years at another school, and so on, and sort of just travel around the country waiting for a tenure track offer. And so I got one pretty much right off the bat from Oklahoma State University and decided that's where I'd want to go. I wanted to basically end up in a college town, an environment that was sort of shaped by the university, and I wanted to be in a large public university. I felt that that's what would best suit me. Mm-hmm. So OSU had those characteristics. And so I have been at OSU now this is my 24th year there. So I've been there for a long time. Started, of course, as an assistant professor. I was tenured in 2004, became a full professor in 2014. And then in 2019, I became the director of the religious studies program here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Great. Professor, if you allow me, let's talk about some of your books and works, article. And what was your purpose in writing each book and article, and what is the story behind each other? I want to share a screen with this book, Pascal's Weger. You are one of the editor of this book. Please tell us about this book and Pascal's Weger.
Well, if I could sort of backtrack a little bit, my interests, as I said, were very much Kant and the philosophy of religion, and this work on Pascal's Wager in a certain way is sort of an exception for me, because 98% of everything that I've published is on Kant. But with regards to Pascal, I think it was around 2012 or so, I just had an idea that had to do with a new way of looking at the many gods objection. Mm-hmm. And so I published a paper on that, but I still wanted to explore the issue more fully. And I also would like to one day offer sort of a Kantian version of Pascal's Wager. Well, I guess it was maybe around 2015, 2016 when I started working on this collection. I was interested in doing more on the wager, and I happened to come across that Cambridge University Press was running a series called Classic Philosophical Arguments. So each volume in that series deals with some of the most famous arguments throughout philosophy. And they had not yet done one on Pascal's Wager. And, arguably that's, maybe the most or one of the top 3 most famous arguments in all the history of philosophy. So I sought out a co-editor, and I originally invited Alan Hayjack, and he was too busy, and he suggested Paul Bartha. And so I contacted Paul, and Paul was very much keen on the project as well. So we put together a proposal, got approved by Cambridge. Mm-hmm. And so roughly from 2016 through 2018, we solicited contributors, we produced our own chapters, we wrote our introduction, and so on. So with regards to my own position, the many gods objection is maybe the most famous objection to Pascal's Wager. And so just the wager basically says, we don't know whether or not God exists. We don't know whether or not there's an afterlife. We may not have any way to determine whether or not it's true. But assuming it's not impossible, then we could say that there is some possibility that God exists and some possibility that there's an afterlife. And the wager basically says, well, the afterlife as it's traditionally presented is of infinite value. You're going to exist for all of eternity in some positive state. And so the wager is set up so that you have one option where effectively you reject religion, and the values that you have are basically just the values of your ordinary life, some finite value. On the other hand, the other option is you affirm religion, and that affirmation then gives you basically entry into that afterlife, which is of infinite value. So if you were to balance off one choice of finite value versus another choice of infinite value, being ignorant as to the probabilities of each, other than saying that it's at least possible, then it is prudentially in our self-interest to choose the better of those options, that is the infinite value of the afterlife. The many gods objection comes in, and it says, well, even if we accept that reasoning, then we have the question, well, it may not just be affirming God. It might be that a specific affirmation of God is necessary. So would it be the Christian God? Would it be the Muslim God? Would it be the Jewish God? Would it be Hinduism? Would it be some just new form of religion, something that we would never have anticipated? So if any theological hypothesis that's not impossible becomes a candidate within the matrix of the wager, and so if we have a plurality of theological hypotheses with possible infinite utility in each case, how do we choose between them? And that's the problem the many gods objection. So the response that I proposed was a kind of a priori, sort of, it's slightly Kantian way of looking at it, saying that maybe there are these a priori principles that could help guide us with regards to evaluating many God hypotheses. So maybe built into the logic of the decision itself are a number of a priori principles that could allow us to eliminate certain many gods hypotheses. And so, for instance, one of the many gods hypotheses that's offered are things like the sidewalk crack God, that if we ever step on a sidewalk crack, then we are not going to get to heaven. And so my dog just ran in, by the way. I hope she doesn't start barking, but just wanted to warn you just in case. She's just looking out the window right now.
That's okay.
And so this sidewalk crack God, it might not be impossible. It might be possible that what God wants us to do is avoid stepping on a sidewalk crack. But what would stepping on a sidewalk crack have to do with the goods and the bads in the afterlife? The idea there is that if that was the universe, where the right and wrong of the universe, whether or not we get to heaven or not, is based upon stepping on a sidewalk crack, that would suggest that this universe is absurd, right? That our conception of morality maybe is so way off that we have no way of grasping right and wrong, if that truly is what the right and wrong is. And so that leads us down a path basically of radical skepticism. And if I then say, I'm not in any position whatsoever to evaluate rightness and wrongness, then why should I be in any position whatsoever to evaluate even issues of expected utility? So some of these alternative hypotheses presuppose certain epistemological positions that could be construed as undermining the logic of the wager itself. And so my paper runs through a set of those.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And in another book, I want to share screen this great book, Kant and Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason. Please tell us about this book. Thank you.
So this really speaks to the kind of the heart of my research. In my first few years at Oklahoma State University, I was kind of just writing on a variety of topics, even though Kant's philosophy of religion did appear with some regularity. And I had a sabbatical in 2008. And during that sabbatical, I read, I think I have it right here, a book that had just come out by Chris Firestone and Nathan Jacobs called In Defense of Kant's Religion.
Uh-huh.
So when I read that book, I had this kind of aha moment, right? I had this moment where it's like I finally had a clear picture
Uh-huh.
of what Kant was up to in his Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason. And that book has been notorious for over 200 years of people not being able to figure out what Kant was up to, and lots of disagreements as to what the overall goals were of that text and so on. So I had this kind of aha moment of finally getting a clear understanding of the nature of the project and understanding how it's grounded within Kant's philosophical principles, where it was often criticized as deviating from them. Instead, I had a real, I thought, clear understanding of how everything in that book flows with utter consistency out of the epistemic strictures of transcendental idealism on the one hand, and Kant's ethical theory on the other hand, mediated by his doctrine of the highest good. And thus, this picture that I had led me to think about working on a book on it. I contacted Routledge. I had previously published something with Routledge. They were very excited about it. And so I guess it was 2012, 2013, I wrote that book. And
Yes.
I think it came out right at the end of 2013 with a 2014 publication date. And I would love to be able to write a second edition. There are a couple things here and there in it where my views have changed. For the most part, I think that I'm pretty much right on track still with my interpretation, but my views have changed with regards to what's called the so-called two experiments of the religion, and I published subsequently on a rethinking of that. The general remark at the end of part one of the religion, which is a really important part of the text. I was kind of really on the fence in this book. I was really kind of distancing myself from any strong commitments about it, because I just saw it as problematic, and I just didn't feel like I had an absolute solid way of addressing the very last point that Kant made in the general remark concerning the role of grace. And then a few years later, I gained more clarity about it and have published on that. So Routledge offered me another book to work within the context of Kant's philosophy of religion. I'm up for a sabbatical next year. So maybe next year I will either write a second edition of this or something similar, something that provides a kind of systematic treatment of Kant's philosophical theology.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And another book I want to share with you, that's book Immanuel Kant's Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals that you edited. Please tell us about this book.
Well, that's actually my very first, and that was another series that Routledge offered called the In Focus series. And what that series was doing was it would include a translation of an important philosophical text with an author's introduction or commentary on that text, and then selected key secondary sources. So basically what this is then is, and I think this was 2001, if I recall. So it includes a historical introduction from me, and then I chose the patent translation of the groundwork that Routledge had copyright access to, and some reprints of a couple important articles and a couple original articles for that collection.
Okay, and I think last year you wrote an article, this article on the alleged Augustinianism in Kant's religion. I think this for 2020. Okay.
Yeah, just last year. That's right.
Okay, just last year. And please tell us about this book and Augustine, Kant, what's related. Thank you.
Yeah, before I do so, let me just bring this up. I don't know if you had this on your list, but I also am the co-editor of this series with Bloomsbury called Kant Sources and Translation. I'm sorry, Kant Sources. Yeah, Kant Sources and Translation is the name of the series. And what we are doing in this is we are translating all of the philosophical textbooks that Kant taught from. So when somebody goes to read Kant's lectures, when somebody goes to read, all those lectures that we have on metaphysics and religion and ethics and so on, those are lectures based upon one or another textbook that Kant was teaching from. But none, or all but one of those textbooks had never been translated. So this series translates all those textbooks and includes an index and a concordance in it to allow people to correlate every section of the textbook that Kant was teaching from with his lecture notes and his Reflexionen. So this series here, for people who want to read Kant's lectures and want to read his Reflexionen, this series here connects all of that with the source material. So you can understand when you're reading these lecture notes, whether Kant was giving you his own ideas or whether or not he was simply just communicating, as we do when we lecture, right? The source textbook that our students had read.
That's great.
Yeah, so sort of in the interim between all these other things in this paper, I wanted to bring this up. But we have about 6 volumes now of it. So this paper is sort of one of those papers that I think speaks to what I would want to do differently if I were to do a second edition of my commentary on the religion. And this paper does 2 things. It first of all just begins by giving a fairly tight overview of how I think people should read Kant's religion, and where there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the overall project is. I address that in my book. I offer a kind of summary of how to read the religion towards the beginning of this, and then I apply it. And I apply it specifically to the question of the role of the Augustinian conception of original sin in part 1 of the religion. So a lot of people, and a lot of people have noted that there are these Augustinian features, quote unquote, to Kant's treatment of original sin in part 1 of the religion. And what I wanted to do in this paper was say that's true in a certain sense, but not in the way that a lot of people are thinking. Because it's not that Kant was adopting an Augustinian conception of original sin. Instead, Kant was saying, okay, within the tradition that I'm a part of, within the Lutheran and Lutheran pietist tradition, they have appropriated the Augustinian conception of original sin. So the early Reformation thinkers were following, you see in Calvin and you see in Luther, this sort of reinvigoration of the Augustinian picture of the nature of the fall and original sin. And that basically is that in Adam's fall, our human capacities were corrupted. Our ability to make judgments, our ability to make moral judgments, and our ability to will the good. So our ability to know the good and our ability to will the good got corrupted in the fall. And that corruption then gets inherited generationally, so that when we try to make our moral judgments, our capacities are corrupted, are compromised, and we can't make proper moral judgments, and we can't will the good without divine aid, without basically a transformative act that, called sanctification in the Christian tradition, whereby we are transformed or changed by God to allow us then to truly know the good and will the good. That basically is the conception of original sin in the Augustinian tradition. And so the Augustinian would hold that because we are so corrupted, we are not able to transform ourselves into being morally good. It requires God to do so. And so we are merely passive. So there's a doctrine in Christianity called passive reception of grace, which means that we are corrupted in such a way that we really can't even do anything at all to undergo this transformation. It has to come solely from God. And then there's a sort of somewhat watered down version of it. In Catholicism, we see that God wants to do this for us, and we just have to stop resisting it. Or similarly, all we need to do is ask for it. So God is waiting for us to ask for it. But all the work is done by God because our faculties are corrupted. So we can't morally improve ourselves. At most, we could have asked God or let God do it to us. And that's the Augustinian or somewhat watered down Augustinian picture of original sin. So what I propose that Kant is doing is he's critiquing that. And the critique basically is that if it is God's work and not our work that makes us into a morally capable being, then we're not good by virtue of our own efforts. And so what Kant basically is concerned with is reviewing Christian doctrines, asking whether or not those Christian doctrines are compatible with rational religion as he conceives of it. And he conceives of rational religion as informed by his moral theory. So that moral theory has to do with what moral status we have must come by way of our own actions. We must, if we are evil, it must be because of us. If we are good, it must be because of us. And so in the general remark of part one, Kant basically says, there is this hypothesis of this need for divine aid. Mm-hmm. We have this question, though, whether or not that divine aid is truly necessary or not, whether we can, through our own efforts, through our efforts alone, become morally good, whether or not divine aid is necessary for it. And so from the epistemological standpoint, Kant says we can't answer it. We're not in a position epistemically to know whether or not we need divine aid. But from a practical standpoint, we could not conceive of ourselves as morally good unless that moral goodness came about through our own willing. And thus Kant comes to the view that if we do become morally good, undergo what's called a change of heart, which is a pietist term, then that transformation must primarily be due to our own efforts. That leaves then the question, are our own efforts alone sufficient? Or maybe there might be needed a supplement, some further help from God. So rather than saying it's all God, which is what the Augustinian would say, or it's us alone, which is what maybe the pietist would say, or the Enlightenment philosopher would say, Kant says, we don't know theoretically, but practically we have to be involved, but we don't know whether our involvement is sufficient. So Kant basically sets it up at the end of the general remark by saying, by the logic of odd implies can, it must be possible. By the principle that we have to own our moral improvement, it has to involve our own efforts. But whether or not those efforts are sufficient or not, we can't know. But what we can do is we could say, in this kind of hypothetical or contingent way, if it is the case that we are not so capable to bring about a change of heart through our efforts alone, then because odd implies can, there will be divine aid to facilitate that. So some kind of further offering that God gives us. What the nature of that offering is again sort of behind the wall of epistemic, right, of our sort of our epistemic boundaries. But the logic that Kant offers is, by virtue of odd implies can, in light of our epistemic constraints, but also given that we have to own our moral status, that the work must primarily be done through our own efforts. And if those efforts aren't sufficient, then we have reason to think there would be divine aid to facilitate that transformation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm really, that's great. Thank you. If you are not tired about my question, I have another article I want to talk I want to ask you to talk about it. This article, the two experiments of Kant's religion. Uh, please talk about this. I'm really learn from you about Kant. Thank you.
Thank you. This is maybe my most controversial article because for quite a few decades, people have interpreted Kant's religion as shaped by two experiments. The German is Zweiten Versuch, right? Two attempts, right? So the Versuch is often translated just as attempt. And so in an English translation from, I think it was 1838, if I recall off the top of my head, in an English translation of Kant's religion, the translator translated Versuch as experiment rather than attempt. And the translations subsequent to that all picked up on that. And it's not completely unreasonable to translate Versuch as experiment, but it is a little bit less of a common way to translate it. And where this term appears is right at the beginning of the preface to the second edition of the religion. So the first edition, 1793, the second edition, 1794. And in the second edition, Kant begins that second edition by saying, there's been a lot of confusion as to the meaning of the title of this book. So let me explain the meaning of the title, right? We have the religion within the boundaries of mere reason. So he says, okay, imagine two spheres, one inside the other. And so we're asking basically about religion within the boundary of that inner sphere. The outer sphere is the whole history, the whole broad range of religious doctrines. The inner sphere is rational religion, and we're wondering about the amount of overlap that exists. So he says that's what I mean by the title. And then he says, okay, now from that standpoint, we can here begin our Zweiten Versuch with respect to this issue. So he never mentions an Ersten Versuch. He never says, here's a first experiment, here's a second experiment. He never, ever, anywhere in the religion says, here's the first experiment, here's a second experiment. Parts 1 and 2 pertain to the first, parts 2 and 3 and 4 pertain to the fourth. He never does anything like that. We never see anything architectonically within the religion itself that speaks to a first-second experiment distinction. And while Kant, in all of his writings, is so enamored with all this architectonic structure, if there was a first-second experiment distinction, why don't we see anything anywhere in the text that refers to it? We don't. So I propose when you read it in the context of he's now reissuing the book, here's his second edition of it. He's opening up that second edition's preface by explaining what people don't understand about the title. Now we understand that title, and now we could move into it again. And so I said, maybe all that he meant here is it's our second attempt. The first edition basically was the first attempt to explain the relationship between historical faith and rational religion. Now I'm publishing my second attempt. And so I track how Kant uses Versuch throughout, the bulk of his writings, how in the historical period, Versuch was used, how it was so often used to describe, here's my project, here's my attempt, this is what I'm going to try to do. And so I really think the natural reading of that passage then is he's simply just saying, here's my second edition, here's my second attempt to lay out this question of what the relationship is between historical faith and rational religion. There was no inkling of a structural difference between a first and second experiment, staging and analysis of religion. No, it was just, that was my first edition, here's my second edition. And when you look at the preface to the first edition, you find a passage in the first edition where he uses Versuch to describe the question of the relationship between historical faith and rational religion. So he does the exact same thing in the second edition, the question of the relationship between historical faith and rational religion, but now he just refers to the engagement with that question as the second attempt to engage with that question. And so I say that all of this literature, and there's so many attempts that people have had to try to make sense of this secret first attempt that Kant never mentions. Where is it? What is it? Is it in the text? Is it some other text? Where does the second experiment begin and the first experiment end? And all these attempts to read the religion by way of that first second distinction. I think that we don't have any reason to think that that was Kant's intent. There's nowhere else anywhere in the text that suggests that that was Kant's intent. It's only mentioned at the beginning of the preface to the second edition. And so I think that all that Kant meant was, here is now our second attempt, the second edition. And, I talked to quite a few Kantians about it, and some are sympathetic, some aren't. Some think that it's painful to accept, but maybe Pasternack is right about this. It's like, I just for so long assumed that there was that first second distinction, but maybe I was wrong and maybe Pasternack is right. And I've gotten that from some people. And I've gotten from others, they just don't want to give up on that distinction. They're too tied to it. But I don't think there's any hermeneutical advantage. We've not found any hermeneutical advantage to reading it by the first second distinction, because there's nothing in the text that correlates to it.
Thank you for your great explain. And the last article I want to share is on a screen, and I ask to talk to that article. Please, let's talk about this. Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess that was 2014, about 7 years ago. And a couple years prior, I had written a paper called The Development and Scope of Kantian Belief. And so you may be familiar with, in the canon of the Critique of Pure Reason and elsewhere, Kant says that our three primary ways of holding to be true, Furvar Halton, my pronunciation was terrible, I'm sure. Those three main modes of holding to be true are Wissen or knowledge, Meinung or opinion, and Glaube, which would be belief or faith. So I had been at that time, basically 2012 through 2015, working through that dynamic. And so here's the middle one, right? Kant on opinion. And I had thought that that was really the most neglected one. There's a lot to say about Wissen. There's a lot to say about Glaube, but there really isn't a lot out there on Meinung. And I thought that really there was a lot to be said about it. And part of it was that you kind of had to connect very disparate passages together. So in the introduction to the Transcendental Analytic, there's a discussion of sort of general epistemology. And Kant rejects the kind of model of epistemology that we associate with Descartes, right? That the philosopher is the one who's going to figure out the general rules for how to differentiate between opinion and knowledge, right? So the idea of justification within the tripartite justified true belief model of knowledge, it's the job of the philosopher to figure out what the justification criteria are. That's the Cartesian model. And so that's sort of the hallmark of normative epistemology. And one thing that Kant says in that introduction to the analytic is that's a mistake. That criteria, epistemic criteria, really ought to be seen as sensitive to the subject matter of inquiry. And that means that what counts as justified knowledge within chemistry would be different than what counts in justified knowledge in physics and justified knowledge in history and so on. So he proposes this, and it's really a very interesting move. When you think about what Kant is doing at that time historically, he's saying what we as philosophers should do is recognize with the development of the sciences that they're the ones who should be handed over. They're the ones who should be given responsibility for epistemology in the sense of what the criteria are for knowledge. Let each of the specific disciplines handle that. So what does the philosopher do if that's taken off the table? What the philosopher should do is engage in the transcendental project. So part of it is Kant sort of explaining his position in relationship to the historical trends in philosophy, saying it's time to give up on normative epistemology as a philosophical project and turn instead to the transcendental epistemology, so to speak. But within that discussion, he adds in a bit that he refers to as general applied logic, as he calls it. So there's another little thing that philosophers could do in addition to moving into the transcendental. The other thing that philosophers could do is talk about basically what virtues there are with regards to our epistemic inquiries. So a philosopher could basically develop a virtue epistemology. And he kind of gives the basic idea of a virtue epistemology there. And so I tie this in this paper, I tie that into the idea of opinion. And I draw out various discussions from his logic notes and elsewhere to start sort of casting what a virtue epistemology from a Kantian standpoint would look like, and how that epistemology is best understood in relationship to opinion. And so think about it this way. Philosophers have traditionally been more focused on knowledge than opinion. But many philosophers would say there's not a lot of objects that we have true knowledge of. There's not a lot of objects that we could say we have certainty about. And so almost everything we believe in is really best construed instead as a matter of opinion rather than knowledge. Now, if say 98% of all of our affirmings are really opinings and not knowings, why don't we have enough philosophical work done on that? So the paper basically says, look at all these great Kantian resources to develop an epistemology of opinion, so to speak. And that epistemology of opinion will have a lot to do with epistemic virtues.
Thank you very much for your excellent answers in this part of the interview. And Professor, as we see, you have paid attention to Kant in some of your books and work and articles. What is fascinating about Kant that has interested you, especially when you was young?
Yeah, well, I think my first encounter with reading Kant was as a freshman, and I read the groundwork. And I wouldn't say that I kind of immediately latched onto Kant as a sort of central philosophical interest of mine. I would say while I was, and here's an interesting irony, while I was at Yale, to work broadly within philosophical theology, it just happened to be the case that Henry Allison was a guest at Yale while I was there. And he was teaching the Critique of Pure Reason. And I was really on the fence as to whether or not to take his class. I was very tempted to, but I also just felt that I just didn't understand Kant well enough. And I was a little bit intimidated by taking, the great Henry Allison's course on Kant, not feeling like I had enough knowledge of Kant. So I decided instead to spend a lot of my just extra study time reading Kant on my own. And so I took out quite a few different books from the library, including Henry Allison's Kant's Transcendental Idealism and Interpretation and Defense. I think I bought a copy. And spent a semester reading the Critique of Pure Reason, using the secondary literature, and on my own at that point, gaining a real interest in Kant. So what interested me about it, I found that I was very sympathetic with transcendental idealism, very, very sympathetic. That the idea that, and this goes way back to when I was in high school and I was challenging issues in science and asking myself questions about the role that my own consciousness plays in my experience. That was sort of a big thing that shifted me away from physics into philosophy in my late teens. And the Critique of Pure Reason spoke to exactly that. And so, while I've always felt that the table of categories, there's a kind of arbitrariness about it. I think most Kantians would agree. Kant doesn't give us that strong of a treatment in his metaphysical deduction of the table. kind of just says, well, this is sort of what Aristotle has and so on. That, nevertheless, the idea that there are these a priori formal structures that determine how we experience the world, and the experiences that we have are a function of those a priori principles, and how I ought not confuse then the outputs basically of that consciousness and the experience that I have with things in themselves, was an idea that I was sort of aligned with from my teens. So some of the details within the Critique of Pure Reason, I wouldn't say I'm always in agreement with, but the general approach of transcendental idealism is one that genuinely captures my philosophical outlook.
Thank you. And now about Kant and religion. First of all, Kant believes he wants to make room for religion. Do you think he succeed in doing this?
I think most definitely. And again, going back to my time at Yale, my advisor at the time was Nicholas Walterstorff, who was right around that time publishing a number of works very hostile to Kant, thinking that Kant was a real threat to religion and a threat to Christianity. And even though I didn't engage with Walterstorff at that time, because I guess I just wasn't philosophically ready to, I didn't understand the issues well enough back then. Since then, I've come to see that Walterstorff and sort of the group of philosophers that he was sort of working with, Philip Quidd and others, were just dead wrong about Kant. That, in fact, if Walterstorff read Kant the way I read Kant, Walterstorff perhaps would have been a champion of Kant's. Because one way to see it is that if you think about religion and science as operating in the same field, then science is a real threat to religion. Because as science discovers things, it forces religion to retreat, or the religious person has to reject principles of science. So if you think about the relationship between science and religion as working in the same field, then there's going to be this clash that I think is unnecessary. And so when Kant, in the B preface to the first critique, talks about finding the limits to knowledge in order to make room for faith, one way to see that is to realize that the domain for religion is not that same domain as the domain for science, that we're not competing between faith beliefs about the physical universe and science about the physical universe. And instead, the proper way to approach religion is from a practical standpoint. So that practical standpoint doesn't necessarily reduce religion, but part of what it does is it liberates the idea of faith from being within that kind of same epistemic structure as knowledge. So a person of faith could then say, science is about the structure of the physical world, and faith is about one's relationship with God. And that relationship needs to be understood in terms of what God wants of me. And so if you think about religion in those terms, it's essentially about my relationship with God and what God wants of me. Then it gives you a way to say science is just a separate thing. Now, there is a possible encroachment, because if the scientist is right about causal determinism, or right that consciousness is merely a function of the brain, then what is the me that we're talking about? But here, transcendental idealism comes in to give us, right, so many wonderful resources by saying that when I investigate the nature of the brain, I'm investigating it from the standpoint of a consciousness that is determined by all these a priori structures. And so it's not that the touchstone of reality is the brain itself, but it's that the brain is being investigated from the standpoint of consciousness. And so let's not confuse the brain with consciousness, and let's not reduce consciousness to the brain. And let's then say that there is this physical expression of brain states or consciousness But if you allow for the phenomenal noumenal distinction, then you'd say that whatever the nature of consciousness is, it's not the same as what the scientist investigates. And so finding the limits to make room for faith opens up, I think, the space that's needed for people to be comfortable with religion without feeling that science is a threat for it, and directs you towards a religion that is not about the physical world and so on. You know, if you go back 3,000 years, 5,000 years, why did humanity look at religion? Because they wanted to explain why there's lightning and why the earth shakes and why my harvest fails, right? So religion was then, thousands of years ago, used as science is today. Now, that's not the domain for religion. The domain for religion, as Kant presents it, is within the practical. It is about my moral efforts and understanding that my moral efforts speak to these interests that I have that go beyond just the physical world, and how those moral efforts can be at least supplemented, strengthened by way of belief in God.
Thank you very much. And Professor, the relationship between religion and reason in Kant's philosophy is one of the topics on which it is difficult to judge quickly and conclusively. Please tell us about this relationship, religion and reason in Kant's philosophy.
So maybe it was sort of the general framework is Kant wants to argue that there is no theoretical rational basis for religious belief. That he goes over the traditional proofs for God's existence and argues that they all fail. And so that failure, I think a lot of scholars looked at that and thought that Kant was against religion because he thinks the proofs for God's existence don't work. But no, Kant thought that if you tied your religion to those proofs, it actually damages religion. So again, finding the limits of knowledge to make room for faith, you cannot prove God's existence. Your relationship with God is not an epistemic one. You don't believe in God because you prove God's existence. That, in a sense, diminishes God and diminishes your relationship to God. Instead, your relationship to God is a matter of a willing commitment to God. It's practical and it's not theoretical. So theoretical reason can't be the basis for religion on its own terms. And it also would be bad for religion, Kant thinks, if it were the case that theoretical reason was the basis for religion. So you instead have a religion that is shaped by your practical life. And so religion falls within the domain of practical reason. Now, how far does practical reason go? Kant provides us with a moral argument or a practical argument for religious belief. So, just kind of to go back to Pascal's wager gives us a practical argument for religious belief, but it's from self-interest. Kant gives us a practical argument for religious belief, but from morality, not from self-interest. So there's a moral argument for religious belief, and that is belief in God and a belief in the immortality of the soul. And so Kant repeats that moral argument, in almost every major work. It comes out in different forms over, roughly 2 decades, but he's constantly articulating religious belief at the level of the practical. So how far does that go? We have practical grounds to believe in God. We have practical grounds to believe in the afterlife. What can we claim about these things on those practical grounds? Kant is very reticent against making any claims about the afterlife. And what he says about the afterlife in the second critique versus in the religion are a little bit at odds with one another too, because I think Kant is struggling to try to figure out what exactly is to be said about the afterlife. And so I think the crux of it is that what motivates religion is the doctrine of the highest good, which we could talk about. And the afterlife then is motivated by the highest good. And the highest good is that there ought to be this ideal state of affairs in which there's an exact distribution of happiness in accordance with moral worth. That can't occur in the physical world. So the afterlife is posited as where that takes place. So then what we can say about the afterlife is simply that within the afterlife, there would be an exact distribution of happiness in accordance with moral worth. Kant was brought up in a Lutheran pietist tradition, and many Lutheran pietists and many other Christians at the time believed in bodily resurrection. So, we now think about the afterlife in terms of heaven, disembodied, floating around, right, which is the Hellenistic Elysian fields. But the idea of the afterlife that was present through a lot of Christianity, it ended up really, being diminished over time, but it started off especially as bodily resurrection. So Kant was brought up in that tradition. And so the idea is that there'll be some transformation of the world. There'll be a new body of some sort in which the world will be shaped by divine justice. And so that's about all that could be said. When it comes to the bodily resurrection side of it, that's just sort of a tendency that Kant has because of his upbringing. Philosophically, all that he really could say is that in that afterlife state, there'll be this distribution of happiness in accordance with moral worth. What could you say about God? That Kant has a theory of analogy. Kant has a way of treating divine properties that's fairly unique. And so if I were to say that God is all powerful, all knowing, and all good, I am grounded, I'm justified in saying that because those are the attributes that are needed for there to be an agent to distribute that happiness. But what I mean by all knowing and all good and all powerful would have to be different. It can't be literally the way we understand our own knowledge and so on. The divine nature is transcendent from that. So when it comes to our knowledge of God, then it's drawn out of the conditions needed for the highest good. But when we talk about God as all powerful, we talk about that analogically. The next issue is things like miracles. Religion is full of doctrines well beyond just God in the afterlife. So people make claims about miracles. And what can the philosopher, the Kantians, say about these things? Kant proposes in the religion a negative criterion. Some miracles, some claims of revelation you can reject as false. Those are the ones that go against morality. God would never command you to do something immoral. So you can reject claims of alleged revelation or miracles that are inconsistent with morality. But as for any claims about miracles or revelation that are consistent with morality, we're never in a position to affirm them in a way that we could expect other people to affirm as well. So I might hold to a certain miracle claim. You might hold to a certain miracle claim, but there cannot be a universal commitment. There's no basis for making a universal commitment to any of those claims. So why would I claim it? Why would I claim there to be a miracle? And that's not something that Kant really gives us a good accounting of. But one way to see it is that there's a value to seeing the world from a religious standpoint. There's a practical value for seeing the world from a religious standpoint. There's a practical value to being part of a community that sees the world from a religious standpoint. And so if you're part of a community, there's a tradition behind that community where there's, a history of religious events, right? A sacred history. And so if you choose to participate within one religious tradition over another, then you will participate in festivals, you'll participate in celebrations of that sacred history. That doesn't mean that you have to assert that they're necessarily true. But what you could say is that it's a way of representing the world that we all share in and find value in. And so that might be a little loose, but I'm not sure if I could pin Kant down more strongly than that when it comes to the broader domain of religious beliefs.
Thank you very much. And Professor, tell us about the theory of knowledge in Kant's philosophy. In university in Iran, professor and teachers emphasize on Pasternack book about theory of knowledge. And I remember when I was a student and enter in university, one of my teachers, they really emphasize on Pasternack books and the exam of Pasternack books, and really emphasize. Please tell us about the theory of knowledge in Kant's philosophy.
Sure. So let's say there's two aspects to it. There's the normative aspect, right, in terms of justified true belief. And then there's the transcendental aspect, right, with respect to transcendental idealism. So something I mentioned earlier is Kant says that the philosopher should back off from trying to offer a normative epistemology. There isn't much at all that the philosopher could say. Kant sort of gestures towards a correspondence theory of truth, a bit of a gesture in that direction, but he calls that the nominal definition of truth, basically a correspondence one. But that's about all that he says the philosopher could say within that traditional domain. But he does have a certain set of standards for epistemic inquiry. Whatever the criteria are, if you're a physicist or a historian or whatever, then for you to truly be certain, what you need to do is not only have sufficient grounds to establish that you're right, but you also ought to look at why people would think other than you and be able to explain where the mistakes are in those other perspectives, rebut those other perspectives. And so this is articulated in the Yesha logic from 1800, which is basically somebody edited Kant's lectures on logic into this book called Kant's Logic. And so the Yesha logic covers a series of steps that any epistemic inquirer should go through. As you come to make a knowledge claim, after you've established, right, that you think that you have sufficient basis for your beliefs, then you ought to also go to your opponents and be able to fully rebut what their views are. And only by then doing that are you justified in claiming knowledge, claiming certainty. So that's the normative side. And then on the transcendental side, then we have not so much Wissen, right, which is the epistemic, just normative notion, but we have erkenntnis or cognition. And so, I'm sure, as you know, much of the critique of pure reason, especially the aesthetic and the analytic, are devoted to the a priori conditions that determine our cognition of things. And so for me to have an object of cognition, for me to say the cup is on the table, then behind that judgment at the transcendental level, there is an accounting of the nature of my outer sense, my inner sense, the fact that I see the world in space, the fact that I see the world in time, and that these spatial temporal aspects are, as he calls them, pure forms of intuition. And that those pure forms of intuition are a priori, they're not concepts, but they're intuitions. It's, all the mechanics, right, of the aesthetic. And then likewise, for me to say the cup is on the table means that I have to experience things as objects. So what is an object? An object is a unity of right? A diversity that's made into a unity. So that means that there has to be a unifying of that plurality. Because if, like, think about this, we're working on trying to get computers to identify objects.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the issues is, where does one object begin and the next one end? So we kind of, when we look at something, we could say, this is the cup on the table, because we have a body of concepts that we apply to our experience to say, there's the cup, there's the table, as opposed to it being something just emerging out of something else, right? Like a big thing that sticks out of a thing. So we say, there's the cup as separate from the table. Why do we experience the world this way? Because of a whole array of judgments about unity and limit, continuity over change, and so on and so forth. And there's all those mechanics that shape our ability to be able to identify any objects to make judgments about. Now, you go back to someone like Locke, and Locke has very much those ideas as well, but he thinks that they're socially contingent, right? That it is just conventional or contingent that we divide up the world as we do. There's no necessity in it. Whereas Kant would say that there's a certain strata of necessity, at least. Some of it might be contingent. There are empirical concepts that are contingent. But nevertheless, there are these a priori rules that shape our ability to think or experience the world in terms of objects. So behind my ability to make normative epistemic claims, I have to have something that I make those normative epistemic claims about. And those things that I make those normative epistemic claims about have this a priori transcendental structure to them.
Thank you very much. And Professor, some believe that if one wants to understand the philosophy, should understand the philosophy of Kant, and the Kant, yes, the top of the mountain of philosophy, and one if understand the before Kant's philosophers before Kant have to know about Kant, and if know about the philosophers after Kant have to know about Kant. And tell us about the importance of Kant in philosophy, and why when we talk about the philosophy of ethic, philosophy of religion, philosophy of language, we need Kant. I mean, a lot of things roots in Kant. Please tell us about this importance.
Well, there is undeniably an historical importance to Kant, in that Kant is in conversation with other major historical figures that predate him, and that subsequent to Kant, major historical figures refer to Kant and characterize their views in relationship to Kant. So I think you have to recognize that the philosophical tradition, right, that Kant is very important to that tradition. And so Kant could give us insights about his precursors, and we could also understand how philosophers subsequent to Kant, that their views were affected by their encounters with Kant. Now, can you be a philosopher of biology or a philosopher of mind or whatever without ever reading Kant? Probably yes, right? Probably yes. There's a lot that you can do philosophically without Kant. It's not like it's impossible to be a specialist in one or another field without Kant, but Kant's important. Kant is, for some aspects of philosophy more so than others. If you want to be an ethicist, for instance, then you really are kind of limiting your tools if you don't bring Kant into it. If you want to be a philosopher of religion, for a long time, people have just ignored Kant as a philosopher of religion, with the exception maybe of his critique of the ontological argument. But as in my work, what's sort of really kind of the heart, I think, of my work for the last 10 or 15 years has been to show that the positive side of Kant's philosophy of religion of his incredible importance, it's been neglected, but it gives us vast amounts of new insights. And so you could be a philosopher of religion without Kant, But once again, you have a whole new and important, ingenious and novel perspective on religion that is you don't see elsewhere. And so you'd be a better philosopher of religion, I think, if you understood Kant well. You'd be a better ethicist by understanding Kant well. So you can be any of these things without Kant. You'd be a better version with understanding Kant in especially some domains. Like when it comes to other things like philosophy of biology and whatnot, maybe Kant is just not as important, but definitely in some domains, in religion, in ethics. Similarly, if you're doing phenomenology, right, to be able to contrast Husserl and Kant can help you better understand Husserl. So that's, I think, the way I would see it.
Thank you very much. And I have a point, maybe not related to the topic of interview. When I was in 15 or 16, I always thinking that the great philosophers, who is a philosopher, travel around the world and know about the world, and this travels shape the idea and makes him a great philosopher. But when I know about Kant, I realized and I found he always be in Quisenberg and not be in travel. Okay. Please tell us about things.
Well, Kant is in a sense at a certain extreme, right? Because we're used to travel. We have automobiles and airplanes and so on, and travel is just normal and easy for us. But you go back a couple hundred years before these modes of transportation, and probably most of humanity did not travel much beyond where they were born. So we have certain figures like Leibniz and I guess Hobbes and Descartes, who are known, right, to have done sort of important work at a few different geographical locations. But I don't know if Hume traveled very much, or Berkeley. I believe Berkeley came to the Americas. Like when I was at Yale, I remember seeing a portrait of Berkeley from his visit to Yale. But most philosophers spent most of their lives, if not all of their lives, still pretty proximate to where they were born. And so one thing to say for sure is that when you look at what Kant says about races, and you look at what Kant says about North American Indians and so on, you see obviously there the bigotry and the biases of his era, right? So no doubt about it that in the past, the lack of cosmopolitan experiences skewed people's thoughts. So they just had third-party hearsay about other religions, about other cultures, about other races that diminished them, no doubt about it. And it's unfortunate. And they would have been better, right, in those areas if they actually had encountered other peoples and learned more. But take Kant on Judaism, for instance. Kant had Jewish students, but then look at his treatment of Judaism. His treatment of Judaism is ugly. It's monstrous. It's terrible, right? It's insulting. And so even though Kant had Jewish students, Kant says Judaism is not truly a religion. And Kant gives us reasons why he thinks it's truly not a religion that are just historically false. That if he knew Judaism better, then he would not have said those things. And his own students never convinced him, never spoke about it. Marcus Hertz never said, Kant, you're wrong about Judaism. So, the blinders that people have may not necessarily be the result of their not traveling. In Kant's case, I don't know why he had such an attitude. Part of his upbringing, Luther is very hostile to Judaism as well. But it's not because Kant didn't travel. It's because Kant wouldn't listen, or he scared away his Jewish students from challenging Kant's views on Judaism. And so, it would be nice if thought thinkers of the past had overcome their naivete or their biases about different parts of the world and different peoples, different religions, and so on. But unfortunately, that's just so often not the case. And it would have been better if they did. So I'm not sure travel is the cure. Travel, I don't think, is necessarily the cure, but it can help. And there's other ways, of course, too, to overcome your biases. And one of those ways often is just encountering people of different faiths, of different races. And even though Kant did, like he had terrible things to say about Black people.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it's awfully sad that he had those attitudes. And I don't think that they should be forgotten. You know, that it is the case, unfortunately, with so many philosophers through history, that what wasn't part of their own little circle, right, which is basically European Christianity, they look down on.
Uh-huh. Thank you. And for the last question in this interview, what's your opinion about the role of philosophers of religion in society?
I think philosophers of religion could be very important. One of the reasons why is, as I said earlier, it's so often the case I'm not sure so much about in other places, but absolutely within the conservative circles of American Christianity, that they use their Christianity to talk about sciences, right? What they think is true and false in science. And I think they do so because they're afraid that if science were right, then they are wrong. And I think that the philosopher could help them rethink all of that. That can they subscribe to all their beliefs if they were to see science as not a threat? In many cases, maybe not in every case, but in many cases, yes. Similarly, to historicize, to understand the history and the development of doctrine. That doctrines don't simply just pop out of nowhere, but there's historical context for them. And that if a person of faith understood that historical context, does it mean that they lose their faith? A lot of people, right, who are specialists in the history of religion, specialists in the philosophy of religion, who are persons of faith. And so it is a challenge to certain approaches to religion. But I think that religion is made better by an openness and an understanding of science. And otherwise, I really do think that religion is hurting itself. So philosophers can help with that. You know, when we teach at a university, consider the following. I'm at Oklahoma State University. Oklahoma is a very conservative Christian part of the United States. Mm-hmm. And so when I talk about philosophy of religion, I'm talking to an audience that may be uncomfortable with these ideas, but it gives them something new, a way to think about, and a way that, there are philosophers who say that religion can only work if you understood it as not in the same battlefield as science. Mm-hmm. And that the true nature of faith is such that you have to understand it in this way, as opposed to a way that is just about, creating this narrative about a young earth and, right, biblical literalism and so on. So there's merits to these other approaches to religion, merits to these other approaches to faith that could help a person gain strength and to reconcile, because otherwise, look at the cognitive dissonance that they're in. You take a history class, you take a science class, you take a class about the Big Bang or about evolution, but you're not supposed to believe any of it because your faith says you're not supposed to believe any of it. That kind of disconnect inside of a person, how could they live that way? How could they be a complete person? That basically says I can't challenge myself. I can't really bring together all these aspects of thought, so I can't think about them. And so the big danger, I think, here is that unless a more amenable relationship was understood between religion and science, it forces the believer to not think. And that's destructive. So, being an educator, I try to give students tools to help them work on that problematic.
Mhm. Professor, thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining me in this interview. When you accept my request, I'm really surprised, and that's a lot of mean to me. Thank you very much. And by the way, what do you think about philosophy in Iran?
I wish I knew more about it. I have to say that I don't. So maybe you could educate me some about it, but I'm not familiar with
Uh-huh.
the schools of thought in Iran. And I do not know much about Islam either. I am the director of religious studies, and we offer courses in Islam. And I'm very proud of our Islamic specialist, whose family is from Iran, by the way. His name is Adam Sultani. But personally, it's just something that I'm not that familiar with.
You know what? We have a great tradition in Islamic philosophy. For example, Avicenna, Averroes, or a lot of philosophers in past. But now,
Yes.
in Department of Philosophy, for example, in Tehran University, uh, students teach a lot of things about philosophy of religion, about philosophy of language, about contemporary philosophers. But that's the problem. The student just read a translated book, and that's why I decide to connect with professors around the world and get knowledge from the origins, you know. Uh, but now philosophy in Iran is very developed, and we are a great professor. We have a great professor, teachers in Tehran University. But now I remember the problem in philosophy, and I share with you. Some believe in Iran that the religion and ideology is harmful for philosophy. Philosophy should be free. And when we talk about philosophy, Islamic philosophy, for example, that's the not good point. That's the harmful for philosophy. Philosophy always should be free and not be ideologic thing.
Right.
What do you think about it?
Well, interestingly, the first preface to Kant's Religion speaks to this about the relationship between Christian biblical theology versus philosophical theology. And there's a history behind Kant's publication of the religion, which I don't need to get into the details, but Kant wrote it basically to reconcile what he's doing with the conservative Christian leadership of Prussia. And so he recognized that there was these Christian theological demands that were pressuring philosophy to being only a certain way. And Kant was looking for a way to reconcile those. And so what he says in part is that the philosophical theologian there's my dog. The philosophical theologian shouldn't necessarily isn't necessarily encroaching upon the biblical theologian, where the philosophical theologian could be looking at things from philosophical presuppositions, and the biblical theologian is just a separate figure And he thought that they could work compatibly with one another. Now, what Kant says in the preface to the first edition versus what he says later aren't necessarily the same. And then he also has this conflict of the faculties book later on that say something a bit different. So honestly, even though Kant was trying to find a way to make them harmonious, it really is a challenge, because philosophy free of religious presuppositions could end up with views that go against those religious presuppositions. And so now what do you do when there is that conflict? Sometimes what you say is say that it's in the nature of philosophy to come into conflict with it, but that doesn't mean that philosophy necessarily is the one that's the right one. It's just that they're separate domains. They're separate ways of describing things. And you shouldn't see one as a threat to another. That's one way to look at it. Mm-hmm. Another way to look at it is to say that religion speaks to a higher truth that philosophy can't get to, right? So that's the kind of thing we see in Kierkegaard, for instance. Mm-hmm. And so there are these higher truths that philosophers have to basically say, look, it's not something we can touch upon. Mm-hmm. A philosopher that does want to touch upon it, then you have the question of what to say, because we have, for instance, this issue of revelation. So here's a doctrine. Many doctrines have their sources in claims of revelation. So you have the Quran, a revelatory work, mm-hmm. and there are doctrines in the Quran. And so Kant would say that the philosopher basically has to be silent about most of it. So the philosopher could say, look, there are these doctrines that are incompatible with morality. Those are ones we could say are incorrect. But with regards to just about everything else, the philosopher says, look, these aren't things that the philosopher could say yes or no to. It's like, if God tells me something, I as a philosopher can't say whether or not it really was God, because everything in my experience I could explain, right, in ways other than it being a revelation. So I can, as a philosopher or as a scientist, say there's no way I could either falsify or verify it, but it might be true. So I think one way to approach this is to say that there's just so much in religion that the philosopher can say, we just don't have the tools. Because one thing that Kant does is, by way of the phenomenal noumenal distinction, by way of what's called the restriction thesis, which limits whatever we could say about things in themselves, that if God is providing you with a revelation, then Kant's own principles are telling you, you can't know whether it's true. You can't know whether or not it's genuinely a revelation. It would be a matter of faith, and that the philosopher can't discount that.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much for this enjoyable interview. I learning a lot of things from you. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry about my language. I'm not good at speaking. You know, I'm a good listener. I understand when you talk, but I'm not good in speaking. I'm sorry, really sorry.
That's fine. Your English is pretty good, and I understood everything you said. So that's.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much again, and God bless you. And goodbye. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Good.